Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here at such an inaugural conference and in such a beautiful setting. Um, Sadly, I just want to say that I feel ashamed to be an American today, the way that our election turned out. Uh, we'll continue to try to do whatever we can to turn people's hearts back to compassion. There is a bit of irony here in that some of the people who are very involved in psychedelics are also going to have prominent positions in the drug administration. So even though I think um, overall it's a tragedy, I think that there will be progress, and more likely than not, with psychedelics in America. And if only some more of the leaders would take them, it would be a bit different. Let me say also, just to tell you, it's a delight to see what's happening. That we thought from America this one, that Italy might be one of the last places in Europe to really adopt psychedelic research. And so, in psychedelic medicine, hopefully this will not be the case. And that's how you move forward. Um, so I'm speaking to you as the president of Calgary Gaps, which I funded right now 38 and a half years ago. It was basically 28 years after MAPS was started that we started our pharmaceutical arm, the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, that is now Lycos Therapeutics. And so I'm not actually speaking to you in any way as a representative of the farm company. It's sort of emerging as its own entity in ways that are not quite the way I had hoped. I had hoped there'd be more of a balance between public benefit, I hope that it would be 100% nonprofit owned of a public benefit pharmaceutical company. But as it turned out, it became very difficult for me to raise the funds that we needed from the donors, and we had to take investors, and that has pretty much changed everything. But at least it will still be moving forwards. So 38 years, this was April 8th of this year was our anniversary. It happened to be the full solar eclipse through the United States. So this is a big celebration. And as far as the goals, I want to say that MAPS has two parallel goals. One has been the development of psychedelics through the regulatory systems to become medicines covered by insurance. But the other goal has been to work on drug policy reform. And I think it's a fundamental human right to explore your consciousness, and that we should be able to have access without having to go through medicine or religion, anything like that. It's been very difficult for people to kind of understand, how do you say on one hand that psychedelics should be available under highly controlled circumstances with trained therapists, not as single medicines covered by insurance. At the same time, you're saying people should be able to access these substances without going through screening, even if they have conditions or anything that they want. And I think both of those can be true at the same time. There are more risks at the same time for non-medical self-administration, but at the same time, the consequences of the war on drugs and prohibition are so counterproductive and so bad that we should immediately lose the war on drugs. On the other hand, we need to introduce honest drug education, pure drugs, drug testing, train people in peer support and treatment on demand. But even without what was in place, I think we should make this immediate switch to end prohibition. So MAPS was funded by about $150 million in donations, and lots of volunteer labor, people with expertise from pharma, from medicine. And what we work towards now, and this is one of the reasons I'm here today, is that the pharma company Lycos will be focused on what they can do in the United States. They've recently, or at the beginning of 2023, is for financial and other reasons pulled out of Europe and focused just on the United States. So MAPS is going to work on globalization of access and on legalization and on a lot of other research that which I'll talk about a bit later, that the pharma company is not doing. Whereas Lagos, we managed to raise about 160 billion actually in investment money. Um, a lot of that value has been lost after the FDA rejection. MAPS is the single largest shareholder of the pharmaceutical company, but we're a minority, and I think we're going to be diluted even more as we go through the routes. And we temporarily appoint majority of Lagos board members, but that may change as well. So MAPS the non-profit, and we'll see what MAPS tell you chooses a big gun, but we have these three basic areas. One is advancing research in all different ways, both in clinical diagnosable disorders, but also, for example, we're going to be working on couples therapy. We work on changing policy, and then we work on shaping culture through our public education efforts. This is now the MAPS logo as interpreted by psychedelic artist Alex Gray. And the reason I share this now is just to make the point that the logo shows that the hands are first and the psychedelic imagery is in the background. And so what that means is really this is about therapy. These are tools. Psychedelics are tools. They can be beneficial. They can be harmful. It depends on the context in which they're taken. And when we talk about therapeutic uses, it's really about we heard it from the interview with the person talking about the psilocybin project, that it was about the sense of safety that you can have with the therapist that permits you to really work on difficult experiences. So in the therapeutic context, it's really about people helping people, and the psychedelic is an adjunct to assist the therapeutic process. I think one of the things I'm concerned about the field of many of these for-profit psychedelic companies, including Lykos, to some extent, is moving more towards being drug companies, not drug plus therapy companies, and more towards the ketamine model, which was Spravato, approved without therapy at all. And there's been recent research in the Journal of Psychopharmacology that demonstrates that when you combine ketamine with therapy, it works better than ketamine alone. And so I think this field is sort of getting some of the wrong messages and is moving more about here are the drugs. And I think, again, our logo and what we really want to emphasize is more about people helping people than it is about the medicines. One of the parts that we do for shaping culture is large conferences to bring the community together. And we're going to have one in Denver in June that I'd like to invite you all to. The one in Denver in 2023, we had 12,400 people come to this conference. It really astonished us. Colorado is one of the states in the United States that has passed natural plant medicine access in a state legal way before the FDA. So it's going into effect on January 1, fortunately. So we're going to be arranging a whole series of psychedelic experiences in different contexts for people to experience if they want to before the several days of the lectures from the conference. So that's something to look forward to. We're trying to demonstrate the policy changes that we have been working towards and to see how we can make them available to people from around the world. So this was just a critical moment in history. This was Timothy Leary. This was 4 years into MAPS. This was the first big conference that we ever had. Big at that point was about 250 people. And this was a fundraising event for MAPS. And so Tim had just given a lecture, and I'd asked him, what kind of advice do you have for those of us that want to work with the government, that want to do the research, that want to make these substances into medicines covered by insurance? How do you think we should work with the government? And he just started laughing. Excuse my language. He said, fuck the government. He said, I am so far past asking for permission for anything, but I'm really glad you're doing it. And this was where he held up my hand. So this, in a way, is the passing of the torch from the early researchers to MAPS. And so now this is 34 years ago. This was before we were able to get permission for any research at all. Psychedelic research had been blocked for several decades. And so this question that I asked him was really, at the time where it was impossible, the FDA was rejecting all the applications. And now, all these years later, what I like to say is that we've buried the ghost of Timothy Leary in Harvard, and there's now this Harvard interdisciplinary program on psychedelics. It's had multiple of the medical schools connected to Harvard and the hospitals, but also there's work at Harvard Community School, which has really got that. Yeah, so there's work at the Divinity School, which is very psychedelicized, work at the law school, School of Government, School of Public Health. So as an example of cultural evolution from Harvard being seen as kind of the center of this psychedelic research that then sort of leaked out of that into the culture and became a cultural advocate. Now moves back lots of research at Harvard. So I started MAPS in 1986. In 1992 was this critical moment at the FDA where they decided to open up the door to psychedelic research. And it was actually in response to a protocol that MAPS had submitted that was for palliative care. It was for cancer patients with anxiety, with MDMA. In 1990, at the end, the FDA had approved Rick Strassman to do a DMT study, but it was more in a negative frame. Could DMT, which is the only endogenous psychedelic we have, could DMT be linked to schizophrenia? So this was in 1992. They said, yes, we're going to open up the door to psychedelic research, and we will permit things, but we'll regulate it the same way we regulate any other pharmaceutical medicine, meaning that all of the experience that people have in non-medical settings counts for nothing, and everything has to be done directly with the protocol submitted to the FDA. So they said you cannot do this work with cancer patients, but we'll permit you to do what's called a phase 1 dose response safety study. So that really is what changed everything and has led to the psychedelic renaissance. And then 1993, 1 year later, the Hefter Research Institute was founded, more from academic researchers. Jesse, in 1994, founded the Council on Spiritual Practices. He's the one that worked a lot with Griffiths and started psilocybin research at Hopkins. In England, 1998, Amanda Fielding founded the Beckley Foundation, which is a combination of drug policy reform and mostly neuroscience. And then 2014, the USONA Institute was founded also as a nonprofit, and USONA is moving forward with psilocybin for major depressive disorder. You may have heard about Compass, which was the first real for-profit psychedelic company after the Massimo Benefit Corp. Those who use psilocybin for treatment-resistant disorder. And they just announced that they have difficulty recruiting people for treatment-resistant depression and pushing back their timelines. They let go 30% of their staff. So the question now is, which organization will make it through the FDA first? The psilocybin, will it be USONA or will it be Compass? At this point, it looks like it might be USONA. So these were just the nonprofit organizations that were founded really in the wake of the FDA saying they'll open up the door to psychedelic research. Just to give you a sense of the increase in the number of scientific publications with psychedelics, you can see that it begins in around 1950. There's a little peak around 1970. That was the height of the psychedelic research in the early days. There was just a backlash, and then the research diminished for 20 years, and almost all the studies from 1970 to 1990 were about the risks of psychedelics and were not from clinical studies. And then starting in 1992, things started climbing, and now we just have an enormous number of studies going on. So it really is a renaissance in psychedelic research. And we have hundreds of for-profit companies. The ones on the left are publicly traded companies that people can buy shares of stock. And then there's private psychedelic companies. Most of these are also intending to go public at some point in time. But the amazing thing is that in those nonprofits that I just pointed out, around $300 billion, including MAPS, has been raised in donations in the last 38 years. However, since 2020, $4 billion has gone into these public and private for-profit psychedelic companies. So there are advantages to becoming publicly traded or access to capital once you switch from philanthropy to investment, but then there's trade-offs about what's really the first priority. Is it really about what's best for patients, or does it become about what's best for the investors? And that's what we see in American healthcare. It's really not about what's best for patients. It's about what's best for the shareholders. And so there's trade-offs here. One of the things that's really important, and I alluded to this at the beginning of my talk, is that we have a conscious strategy of how do we take psychedelics and build bipartisan support. Psychedelics in the 60s were associated with the counterculture, with the anti-Vietnam War movement. They were associated with the left. They were associated with revolution, with protests. And so to bring psychedelics back, it was really important that we do so in a bipartisan way. And so that was, in a way, a conscious choice to work with MDMA for PTSD, because that got us working with veterans, and the veterans are highly esteemed in the United States and also have a lot of bipartisan support. So Dan Crenshaw is a former Navy SEAL, and he's a member of Congress. He's a strong Trump supporter, but he's also very much supportive of psychedelic research. And he invited me to speak with him and to his constituents at this healthcare summit in 2001. This is Rick Perry. Rick Perry is the former governor of Texas, and he was on Trump's cabinet, Secretary of Energy. He's also a Trump supporter right now, but he has heard about so many of the Navy SEALs that have gone down to Mexico for ibogaine when they weren't getting the treatment that they really thought they needed from the VA. And so he has become one of the main advocates for psychedelics. But he helped us open the conference 2 years ago. We had the Democratic governor of Colorado did a welcoming talk, and then Rick Perry spoke. And one of my favorite moments at the conference was Rick Perry was speaking about how he and I are ideological opposites, and yet we've come to agree on really poor psychedelics. And Governor Polis whispers in my ear, "How much did you have to pay him to speak?" And I was like, "You didn't have to pay him anything. He believes it." It's just, it was so astonishing that to Governor Polis that something like this would be coming out in public about psychedelics. So this is the key to going forward, and this is why I think that despite the results of the election, that psychedelics and psychedelic research and access will move forward. From a social perspective, in terms of changing attitudes, and this I think will relate to drug policy reform in Italy as well, what we've seen is that medicalization precedes legalization. That polling has been done about why people vote for medical marijuana, and then why do they vote for legalization of marijuana. And so the main factor that why people would support legalization of marijuana is that they know a medical marijuana patient. There's so much information, so much misinformation, people don't know what to believe. But if they know someone that they trust and say, "Hey, this helped me," then they question everything else. So this is a chart of American attitudes towards the legalization of marijuana. And you can see in 1969, it's really, really low, just a little bit more than 10%. It rises through the 70s. Then we have this sort of backlash, and Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan gets elected in 1980, and then things stay the same for about 20 years. And what starts to happen for this decline, again, is 1996 is California and Arizona supporting medical marijuana and start setting up dispensaries, and people started being able to speak in public about their beneficial uses. And now we've got well over, actually it's now about 80% of people are in favor of legal access to medical marijuana, and also to marijuana legalization for all purposes. So I think the research, the science, and the media discussions and the public discussions about the medical use are the real way to be most effective in changing overall drug policy. And how this is translated is because of the work of psilocybin and the research from MDMA and others, there's been a lot of public attitudes about now the beneficial use of psychedelics. So Oregon in 2020 made mushrooms legally available in the state by state-trained guides. It's federally illegal, but the federal government is not interfering. And there was no insurance coverage. And around 5,000 people that were received psilocybin in Oregon more than all of the people in all of the clinical trials with psilocybin. And then in Colorado in 2022, they asked an expansion that was for all a range of different psychedelic plants. When you add synthetics like MDMA or LSD, and polling was done before these initiatives were finalized, then people don't pass it. They have this idea plants are okay, but synthetics make them nervous. So hopefully that will change one day. I don't think there's a real significant difference at all between a plant-derived psychedelic and a lab-derived psychedelic. And then in Massachusetts, there was a ballot measure that was similar to Colorado. And I'm sad to say $8 million was raised on this initiative campaign. And in the election, it failed. It got 43%, 57% were against it. Part of this, I think, is the change in public attitudes after the FDA rejection of MDMA. So basically, we've kind of lost the narrative of what's going on, and there's a lot more public education that we're going to be needed to do. In order to try to help the public think about drug policy reform, as I said, there's more risks in the non-medical access to it. And so how do we address that? How do we address people's fears and concerns? And so what BAMS has done, starting in 2003, starting at Bloom Festival in Portugal in 2002, then Burning Man in 2003, and other festivals, is we bring psychedelic therapists to these festivals where people are using a lot of psychedelics, and then we offer them assistance when people get into difficult states, so that there are going to be people who take psychedelics for recreation, for parties, and they just want to have good experiences, but that's not how psychedelics work. They bring things to the surface. And if you're not prepared to deal with the difficult material, then you try to suppress it, you can be worse off. And there's a lot of stories about how psychedelics have made people worse off. So what we do is we bring therapists who volunteer their time to support people who end up having difficult experiences. And so that's been really helpful to demonstrate a model for a post-prohibition world. Now, with MDMA, it took us till 2022 to have 2 successful phase 3 studies completed. December 11, 2023, submitted a new drug application to the FDA. FDA takes 2 months to look at, will they accept the file? Is there enough information in the file that's generated for them to evaluate whether the safety and efficacy was proven? And they said, yes, there was. February 9th, they said priority review, this is a breakthrough therapy. And then on June 4th, there was an FDA advisory committee meeting. But what happened here was that Lykos, as a traditional pharma company filled by traditional pharmaceutical people, said that it's our view that we should not respond to anything in the public. We should have a quiet period. And they persuaded enough members of the MAPS board to silence MAPS's communications, to silence line communications. And so this quiet period was a disaster. And what happened was that there were critics, there were criticisms about scientific method, the double-blind hit scientific journals and media, and there was no response from the company. And so the narrative became more and more negative, and this quiet period became more and more self-destructive, and ended up with this advisory committee on June 4th saying, we do not recommend approval. And that was actually heartbreaking, because we had done so much work for 38 years to reach this point, and then because we had too many traditional pharma people at the pharma company, and they had a traditional approach for something that is not traditional, you need to be constantly proactively educating people about why you're doing what you're doing, how it's different than normal. So there was then too much negativity, and the FDA advisory committee said no. Now, what had happened also was a series of different issues. So functional unblinding was one of the main critiques that the advisory committee had. Now, it's very difficult to do double-blind studies of psychedelics. In fact, it's virtually impossible. My dissertation that I did at K School was about the FDA drug development path, and a big part of the chapters were about the double-blind. And what I thought we would do is therapy with low dose MDMA versus therapy with full dose. I thought that was the best methodological approach. Everybody has the same expectations. Everybody's going to get MDMA. They're all willing to be in either group. And so we spent 16 years from 2000 to 2016 doing phase 2 pilot studies of MDMA. The first actually began in Madrid with women survivors of sexual abuse. It was going fairly well. We had some media attention. This is back in 2000. And it alerted the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority. They shut the study down for political reasons. We were unable to really mobilize enough response. And so that ended the research in Spain for a long time, but we were able to start it in the U.S. So in these 16 years, we ended up also starting stuff in Switzerland, Israel, and Canada. We tested therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75, 100, 125, and 150. So we did a whole dose response range. And the goal was to find the dose of MDMA that would serve as a active placebo in a double-blind context. And so the challenge is microdosing is too low. You don't notice it. You won't be able to confuse it with full dose. And so the challenge was to find the low dose that's high enough to cause confusion, but not so high that you have such therapeutic potential that then the two groups are very similar. And so to our surprise, during these 16 years, what we discovered is that the low doses did enhance the blinding, but they made people uncomfortable. They activated them. These are now severe PTSD patients. They got activated, but there wasn't enough fear reduction. And so it made them uncomfortable. And the analogy is turbulence in an airplane. You're starting to take off. In an airplane, there can be a lot of turbulence, and then you get above clouds, and it can be smooth sailing. So we showed that those people with the low doses still improved, but they didn't improve as much as the people that got therapy with no MDMA at all. And then we discovered, this was also a big surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group did really, really well. We did a study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. Again, part of this idea of building bipartisan support and reaching to the police that have very traumatizing jobs, that we ended up showing that we did 30 milligrams, 75 milligrams, and 125, and the 75 milligram dose actually did even better than the 125. So there was no sweet spot where the active placebo wasn't either compromising the therapy or then taking over and be helping the therapy. So we went to the FDA and we said, during this 8-month process in 2017, let's negotiate the phase 3 design together, special protocol assessment process, which we did. And the end result was that the FDA said, we want you to do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. And they said there's 2 main ways to reduce experimenter bias in that way. The first is random assignment, very simple. Everybody can easily do that in the research protocol. And then the second is independent raters who are blind to the condition of whether people were in the control group or the active group. And they do the rating so that people don't rate themselves, the therapists don't rate them. And so we instituted that, and we thought that that would be sufficient. As it turned out, the people that we negotiated with in 2017 who gave us these agreement letters and made these promises to us about here's how to design, they left the FDA. And the new people at the FDA Division of Psychiatry are more conservative than the people that we negotiated with. So this became a problem where they were concerned unduly, I think, about functional unblinding. As it turns out, blinding fails a lot of the time, even in traditional pharmaceutical drug development. For SSRIs, the studies rarely remain blind because of the side effect profiles. The same is true for drugs for schizophrenia, that there's a lot of ways where the blind is pierced, you could say, but it became ketamine. The ketamine studies were not blind, and yet it was approved by the FDA. So this became kind of a reason to sort of justify their anxieties. There was a critique of our therapeutic method, which was been studied for 24 years. FDA said they don't regulate therapy. They don't really need to. That is true that they don't regulate therapy. They were concerned about adverse events reporting. We had one example of therapist misconduct in a serious way, which out of 400, that it became focus of critique. There was claims of lack of diversity, even though we did have diverse participants. And this was another one that was appropriate questions, but you need to go from the questions to the actual data. So it turned out that 40% of the people that had been in our study had prior use of MDMA or ecstasy. And so the concern was that these 40% of the people are prone to have better experiences. They like MDMA. That's why they're volunteering. They'll have fewer side effects. They'll have better outcomes than the 60%. This was the critique. But at the advisory committee meeting, they raised the critiques, but they didn't give the company enough time to respond. So the 60% who never had done MDMA responded the same as the 40% who had, and in both safety and efficacy. So there was really no difference. This didn't really matter, but it was a concern that's valid to raise, but you can't just leave it that way. So it was really frustrating to see some of these concerns without the answer. The other point to start out by the way I talked about, it's not the drug, it's the therapy. 40% of these people had done MDMA before and they still had severe PTSD. So again, it's about the therapeutic context. Now, light was pulled back from Europe early 2023, and we had done studies in the Czech Republic, in Germany, and in the Netherlands, in England, elsewhere, and the Dutch had seen how effective the work had been. And so they set up the Dutch State Committee on MDMA to decide, now that there was no pharmaceutical company trying to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe, what should they do with a major unmet medical need for PTSD? So they started this Dutch State Committee on MDMA. It was the equivalent of the FDA Advisory Committee, except for it had real subject matter experts. It had a year to review the same data that the advisory committee had a couple of weeks to review. And it had to publish a report to justify its findings. The FDA advisory committee meeting just took 8 hours and people would vote, but they didn't have to justify, they didn't have to explain. So this Dutch committee came out 2 days after the FDA advisory committee with their report, and they came to the exact opposite conclusions. They said efficacy was proven, safety was proven, and because there's an unmet medical need, the government should immediately authorize what they called naturalist studies, sort of compassionate use, real-world evidence, about some data gathering before and after. And this was something that, for reasons that are unclear, Lykos decided not to let people know about this. So this Dutch committee was a scientific sort of rebuttal to the advisory committee meeting, but it wasn't well known and wasn't really shared with the FDA or anything. It was really a major blunder for Lykos. And so without knowing about the Dutch committee, August 9th, FDA rejected approval. And there's negotiations going on right now, but I think what's likely to happen is another phase 3 study. However, those people that are sympathetic with psychedelics, that are involved in the Trump administration, may be more sympathetic. They're very much anti-bureaucracy, and they may be willing to force the FDA to take another look at this. We'll see. So October 3rd, not that long ago, the Dutch Parliament Committee on Mental Health met, and they accepted the recommendations of the Dutch State Committee to do these naturalist studies. So multi-year, large-scale naturalist study within the frameworks of scientific research. It's like real-world data, meaning that it's not a protocol where everybody has to get the same amount of MDMA sessions. This can be customized to each individual, and also you can expand the prep and the integration sessions as well. And a new nonprofit has been started in Europe with Eric Vermetten, who was the one that was involved with research in the Netherlands. He's the former head of the chief psychiatrist at the Ministry of Defense in the Netherlands, and Victor Chaptal, one of the co-founders of Psychedelic Europe. And so this is what I think is possible in Europe. Maybe it could be done in Italy, would be to try to get permission for sort of compassionate use with some data gathering. And the potential here is to do nonprofit drug development in Europe. It's much lower cost to do these naturalistic studies that controls studies. And so there would need to be negotiations with the EMA and also in England with their FDA equivalent MHRA to see what kind of evidence would they need to approve in Europe. And could we raise philanthropy to develop MDMA in Europe with open science, no patents, and turn it immediately into a generic? So that's the potential of what might happen in Europe if we can raise the funds for that. So now FDA and Lykos are in ongoing negotiations, whether they will actually need to do a phase 3 study. That's currently the way it looks. And if that is the case, I think it will delay approval for about 3 years. But we don't know for sure on that. This is just to talk about formal dispute. So I mentioned that the FDA Division of Psychiatry was the leadership shifted, and they're much more conservative people now. And they've made a series of decisions that I felt were way too conservative. And so MAPS hires lawyers, scientists, and we've challenged the FDA on these what's called formal dispute resolution requests, where you present your data, but you do it in a legal way, and it goes to higher and higher levels of the FDA. So we had a protocol that we submitted to the earlier people at the FDA to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training that the FDA gave us permission for. 125 of our therapists went through that from around the world, some from Europe, and this was very helpful. These therapists said that this was extremely helpful for them to understand MDMA, and it would translate into them being able to treat their patients better. The FDA also, so when we submitted a new protocol to new people at FDA, they said, we never give you a study from protocol for this. Not only that, but your lead therapists are not qualified. We let you do licensed therapists in phase 3, but now we're rethinking it. Everybody, the lead therapist needs to be a doctor or a PhD. And not only that, but you need a doctor on site. In phase 3, we had doctor on call, medical screening, doctor on call, but not doctor on site. And so these were just, in a way, poison pills to the entire industry. If you have to have a doctor on site, all these private practice therapists can't afford that. This idea that MD PhDs are somehow more qualified than licensed therapists is really wrong. And that's also has to be expense. And so we did this formal dispute, and we won on every single point. And not only did we win for MAPS, but it changed the entire field. So nobody has to have MD PhD as the lead therapist. And the physicians do not need to be on site. They just need to be on call. And then we had another formal dispute. We have from the state of Michigan that legalized marijuana. We have a $12.9 million grant to do cannabis for 320 veterans with PTSD. So cannabis is palliative. It's not curative. It's not ideal. You need to use it every day. If you stop using it, the symptoms come back. But a lot of people use it. It's an alternative to SSRIs. It has fewer side effects. But right now, all of the medical marijuana patients in America need to pay for it themselves because it's not covered by insurance, because it hasn't gone through the FDA. So we're trying to do this study at FDA. These same people at the Division of Psychiatry that rejected MDMA were blocking us from studying smoked marijuana, blocking us from studying vaporized marijuana, blocking us from patient self-titration, meaning patients adjust their dose. Okay, 5 more minutes. And it looks like we're going to win on this one as well. So this is just to say that the Division of Psychiatry is kind of uncertain about how they make decisions, more conservative, and so we will see the negotiations like so. MAPS, as the nonprofit, wants to do couples therapy research, and this is again not clearly a diagnosable disorder, so it's not easily monetizable. Although there's nothing that blocks FDA from approving it. We want to do work in pediatric studies. We're interested very much in refugees and migrants. One day, and we're trying to do these global humanitarian projects now. And I think we need to move from treating individuals to treating groups. And when we have families traumatized together, it might make sense to treat them together. And the FDA has also said that if they approve MDMA for PTSD, it would be for 18 years and older, but they would require the pharma company like us to do studies in adolescents. And then moving down the line. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the sooner that you can treat people to the trauma, the better it is. And so we're looking forward to this pediatric studies. And then group therapy is just a way to really scale. And there's a series of studies that are being initiated now. I personally think that the individual therapy will work better than the group therapy in the short run, but in the group integration and the group support for each other can make up for that. So in Israel now, there's going to be a study with around 240 people, and it will be a direct comparison of people with PTSD who go through individual therapy. They'll be randomized either to individual therapy or to group therapy with 3 sessions. And the first one of this was at the Portland, Oregon VA. And this was 6 people in the group, 4 therapists, and each get 2 MDMA sessions. The first individual, so that they understand the drug and they understand how to process their emotions. And then they do it together in a group. And so 2 cohorts have gone through this, and they all have said that they would want a 3rd session in a group context. So now they're modifying this, and so there may be then an individual session initially, and then 2 group sessions with group preparation and integration. This is this project in Israel that I mentioned. It will start also with 2 therapists, 2 assistants, and 6 participants, and over time they'll adjust the number of people, the participants, trying to find what is the optimum number, and then also the more you have participants, the more you can reduce the cost of it. And so this will be a study to evaluate the various numbers of therapists, assistants, and participants. This was a situation where also in Israel, where it's 4 therapists for 6 participants, but they get 3 MDMA sessions, the first 2 individual, and then the 3rd is a group. So you can see there's all these different models that are going to be studied for group therapy. And then in England, in King's College, this is going to be 2 therapists for 3 veterans. So I think as we move forward and think about the work that MAPS is going to try to do internationally in humanitarian projects, we're doing a training in Australia that's starting in a few days. We're working in Ukraine and going to do a training with Ukrainian therapists probably the second half of March. We've done work in Bosnia and had 2 trainings in Sarajevo. So there's going to be a project with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre from about 31 years ago or so from their civil war. We're working in Denmark with a group called Oasis. And what they're interested in working on is with Syrian refugees who are now Danish citizens with PTSD. And in Rwanda, we had a series of conversations there. And in Somaliland, we were the farthest along, where we actually sent MDMA to Somaliland and trained the therapists in our 6-day sort of watching videotapes, learning about the treatment manual, and got a protocol in Somaliland to give MDMA to the therapists as part of their training before they work with PTSD patients. And the results are pretty astonishing from what the therapists have to say. So we think that it's clear, at least so far, that the work with psychedelics, because we're all humans, it can work in different cultural contexts. And we try to think about the burden of trauma on humanity, the 2 different kinds. One is epigenetic, multi-generational trauma. The other is trauma that you experienced in your lifetime. And we think that over time, if we really localize the access to psychedelics, that we can make a major impact on the burden of trauma in humanity, which will, I think, be best addressed by both drug development and also drug policy reform. And you could also think about it as 2 different ways. One is like preventativeness, helping people to have experiences, process their trauma before it turns into more serious symptoms, and then working in a medical context to treat people worse. That's one endpoint to the symptoms. So I think the promise of psychedelics is great, and I think over time we will see a lot of progress. But then, I think we'll begin in each of the different countries with medical research, with scientific research. That's the way to open the door, and then we'll move towards broader reform. So I'm really happy to be here to see MAPS Italia and to see how things develop here over the next decades. Thank you, Darryl.